I welcome you this afternoon on behalf of my colleague Jeff DeBelco, that is doing precisely what I'm doing here, 2 floors below, at another discussion, another important discussion. Jeff is the director of the Environmental Change and Security Program here, and we have partnered in this program that was brought to us by a dear, dear friend and a member of the Brazil Institute Advisory Council, Tom Lovejoy. He's a great supporter and a person whose guidance I always look for. We are here today to have the second of a series of discussions on managing the planet's fresh water. We will hear from Tom Lovejoy, that I would like to invite to set the stage for us, and then Karin Krchnak, Director of the International Water Policy at the Nature Conservancy, and Dann Sklarew. Dan. He'll read his name, because that's, Portuguese has its limitations. So, no, let's say it. What's your name?
Sklarew.
Okay,
in every language
you heard him. And he is he's an associate professor at George Mason University, where which was recently enriched by the presence of our dear Tom. With that, I would like to invite Tom here to set the stage and talk to us about the series that will continue next month with another event. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paulo, as always. Long-time colleague in the quest for sustainability in dealing with the environmental challenges in Brazil, but also beyond. So the notion of this series, for those who are new to it, and it is only the second monthly session, is basically that the impact of human activities on the planet and the way it functions and its biology has risen to a scale that deserves a commensurate response, essentially really thinking about how can we manage this situation, essentially manage the planet in a proactive way to lead to a better and more sustainable future for humanity and the rest of life on Earth. So it's basically trying to encourage thinking at a bigger scale, and it's pretty hard to be doing that without pretty quickly coming to the realization that it is the water planet, and we need to be thinking about both the marine ecosystems and the freshwater ecosystems of the planet at the same kind of scale as we might be thinking about managing it for biodiversity or other things. So we have a dual star program for us this afternoon. Next month, there will be a session basically looking at human perspectives by Susie Crate and Wade Davis. And then Bill Summers is organizing one the following month to look at issues around the global forests. And in May, Jane Lubchenco is organizing a session around the world's oceans, all with the theme of managing the planet. So I think that's sufficient to frame what I think will be a terrific program, and I think, Karin, you lead off.
Actually, Dan.
Or Dan? Okay. So if you have a PowerPoint, do you? Then I think we ought to go down to the front row so we can actually see it.
Oh, okay.
Let me make sure I know how this works first.
I might switch and move.
Okay, we'll go manual. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Paulo and as well as Jeff DeBelko and his group in the Environmental Change and Security Project here for hosting us, Dr. Lovejoy for organizing this series through an effort to address all of the issues we're dealing with planet-wide. And Karin and I would also like to recognize the several students that are in the audience today, as you are the people who will be implementing the ideas that we present today, and hopefully a lot more and better ones. First question we often hear is, well, is freshwater really a global problem? I mean, maybe there's not enough water here, or maybe not too much water there, but is it really a global problem? And so I'd like to invite you all just to take a moment and write down, what you think is a global freshwater problem on your sheet or in your mind, and about halfway through, we'll share some of our senses of what the problems are, and if we've forgotten any, we'll invite you to share yours. So if you want to take a moment and do that, we'll make it a little more interactive than normal. And then during the second half of our presentation, we'll actually turn to some of the solutions that we've discovered or are aware of, and wrap up with a lively discussion, hopefully, of other potentially bold or exciting, incremental or revolutionary opportunities and approaches we could take to address these problems. So go ahead and write down for a second what you might consider to be a problem that acts on a global level with respect to freshwater. And I'll mosey through in just a second. Okay. Well, first of all, one might argue that your perspective on what the global freshwater problems are might matter according to where you are on the planet. And in particular, we see two spaces on the planet here. First, North America, where, there's a little bit of dry area there, water-stressed locations in the Pacific Southwest. But by and large, we have a very green part of the planet, and it seems to be more of a challenge not to be next to an overflowing levee or river bank by comparison to the Middle East, where obviously we have extreme water scarcity, and seasonality isn't so much a question as interannual rainfall patterns that they refill the relatively dry aquifers and ancient riverbeds in that area. So as we're going through this, we'll be talking from a global scale, but really a lot of it is about realizing that these two parts of the world, the water-rich and the water-poor, are intimately connected, and as our population gets to the level it's approaching today, and to 9 to 15 billion people by 2050, that we recognize that water is really connects us across the planet. So how does it do so? Well, as a global crisis, we know that water is necessary for all life, and we haven't come up with a substitute for it yet. Granted, some sodas may be up there in some people's thirst and sustenance list. There are about 1.1 billion people who have no access to safe drinking water, or very little, and about 2.3 billion who are without basic sanitation. There's growing water scarcity in various parts of the world, such as I just noted, and rapid declines we're seeing in aquatic biodiversity, as well as the organisms that depend on that biodiversity. Human activities, physical alteration of the habitat, economic exchanges of water between regions, and institutional structures which prevent efficient use of water are all impacting this connectivity of the water cycle, the quality of our water, and the flows at ever larger scales. Maybe what was a local phenomenon in Mesopotamia a few thousand years ago is now really global transfers in the water cycle. Mitigated by human beings. And finally, of course, as many of us are very acutely aware, climate change is altering the global water cycle in ways that we are scarcely ready to deal with. Now, one of my students kind of asked me a number of years ago, why do we have a water problem? There's so much water on the planet. Why are we even talking about this? In fact, there is. The planet has about 97% of the Earth's water is actually in saline areas, the oceans and the seas. The remaining 3%, most of that, about two-thirds, is in ice caps and glaciers, a little bit less every year as global warming kicks in. The remaining 30% of that is in groundwater, and just a teeny tad bit of that is in surface water, the most extractable and accessible water. Of that, we have roughly 90%, 87% is in lakes, so that's fairly accessible to us as long-term storage without a lot of effort. A bit in swamps, and just a tiny, tiny bit, 2% in rivers and streams, where it's essentially renewable interest off the precipitation of the associated basin. One of the challenges then is with that 2% that's left, how can we keep it going? How can we keep that renewable resource going, and also in other surface and near-surface waters? A few terms that we may make use of and you may bring into your problems and solutions. One is fossil water. These ancient aquifers, often depleted by our use and pumping relative to their recharge rates. At a conference which I helped to organize in South Africa, we actually brought fossil water from Australia that was estimated to be about 1 million years old, and did a taste test next to Dasani water. I'm not allowed to share the results, as Coke was one of our sponsors. But blue water includes surface fresh water that people and nature share. So in this case, we're talking about the water that you're seeing in a river or a lake or a pond or behind a reservoir. Now, green water is kind of an interesting idea. The idea is this is the water that's actually directly available to plants, so it's fallen on a watershed, and it's essentially what's really driving our consumptive water use for crops. And what I mean by consumptive water use is it's the water that is used in our croplands and never makes it back out into surface water out to the sea. So that consumptive water resource use is essentially the using up of water. Non-consumptive use is like when we drink some water, it comes out the other side and ends up back in a river reservoir. Essentially is renewing itself as long as we can keep it clean, but that non-consumptive water use is back up in the atmosphere. A few other terms, black and gray water are essentially domestic wastewater with, or in the case of gray water, without human waste in it. And finally, virtual water, which is a very interesting concept that has developed over the last decade or two, which is about the water we use for food production and trade. So if I'm actually using 100 kilograms of water or 100 liters of water to produce a certain quantity of meat, and I ship that meat across the planet, essentially I used 100 kilograms of water in international trade, and that's that virtual water. Now, many of you can recall from grade school the water cycle. This is a slightly elaborated version of it. The key issue here is as water on the planet goes from a liquid phase into a gaseous phase as water vapor, back down in precipitation in either liquid or solid forms, we essentially have interceded and altered the water cycle at local, regional, and increasingly global scales at all steps along this way. So, for example, as many of you are aware, we not only dam water, but we divert it and convert it transfer it between basins across vast distances. For example, in China right now, one of the largest interbasin transfers is going on, which is basically going to be moving across 3 canals from the humid south of the country to the arid north of the country, massive, massive quantities of water, an effort that will make Three Gorges Dam look fairly small by comparison as a public works project. Downstream in the oceans, obviously the effects of climate change and global warming will increase that the evapotranspiration, or the evaporation of the oceans, and the evapotranspiration, we believe, of those plant species that are not otherwise affected by carbon dioxide limitation. And each step along the way, we're affecting the water cycle. So global warming in particular has an impact that's really worth focusing on. Again, that hotter air is increasing evapotranspiration. The transpiration part is basically the plant's release of water and other organisms. That results in a rise in water vapor, a notable greenhouse gas. More extreme weather events, as we know, we've been talking about droughts and floods increasing in relatively dry and wet locations, respectively. And along with that goes increasing metabolic rates of humans and other organisms, increasing our water needs, and a likely shift in dominant flora and fauna from those that can deal with moderate weather and climate to those that are more adapted towards the extremes. Another major impact that we're facing with respect to climate change, and this is very real and ongoing, is the loss of ancient mountain glaciers. We've seen glacial retreats in Europe, in South America, and pretty much anywhere where, and in the Himalayas, pretty much anywhere where there's been glaciers, they've been retreating. Now, some might say that's been going on since the last ice age, but it's very clear that that's sped up over the last few decades. The impact of that is most acute for those populations, crops, and organisms that live downstream and are expecting the glacial melt to be for their drinking water, for their irrigation, etc. But it also has an impact on those organisms that are adapted for certain seasonality to ice-related or ice and snow-related precipitation, and its later melt in what we call in this region the spring freshet. It also, as I mentioned before, feeds a sea level rise, inundating coastal wetlands, and the saltwater encroachment can actually foul those coastal aquifers where a good deal of humanity lives and thrives atop. Now, some of the challenges we have beyond climate change include the inadequate water plans and infrastructure. For example, we've settled ourselves down in drought, flood, and sinkhole-prone zones. Here's an example from Guatemala City in 2010. This sinkhole is 300 feet deep. Think about 30 stories building just zapped down in a single instant in 2010. And this was following another sinkhole that appeared in the city in 2007. It's thought that at least the 2007 one was related to both a tropical storm coming through and a failure of the sewer system underneath that area. This is very profound impact, obviously, if you live there. To the right, you'll see the aging infrastructure upon pretty much all our cities depend. Here in Washington, D.C., I think a number of you can probably recall the bursting pipes that sent some cars down the road I think a summer or two ago. We've had some lead pipe issues. All of these things are about infrastructure that was put in place before our settlements really built up on top of that. And as a result, we're dealing with infrastructure that is very, very difficult to, pick up the city, fix the infrastructure, and drop the city back down again. So this is an issue pretty much anywhere where cities were built up before the late 20th century, which means only China is going to have a 21st century water infrastructure for the next little while. So this infrastructure is poorly designed, maintained, outdated, and it exists both in rural areas in the context of irrigation as well as in urban areas. I'd like to give an example of the challenge of having water in one place but not another, and how that really illustrates what's going on globally. And this is my tale of two lake basins, courtesy in part of the World Bank's Lake Basin Management Initiative. The first lake is Lake Baikal up in Russia, which is the world's largest lake by volume, and the Aral Sea over in Central Asia, which was the world's fourth largest lake at the beginning of, or lake basin, if you will, at the beginning of the 20th century, and now is not quite in that league. The key point I wanted to make about Lake Baikal in Russia is that the volume of this one lake, this one deep lake, is about 6 times the annual consumptive water use that we have globally for 17 major crops. In other words, there's a lot of liquid fresh water on the planet, but we don't grow all our crops right around Lake Baikal in Russia for a number of reasons you can probably guess. The Aral Sea, by contrast, has provided an opportunity for irrigation, things like that, where the basin itself has fed a very healthy cotton production over the last 50 years, and you see some young gentlemen there picking cotton. But the net result of that has been the diversion of those incoming waters has virtually reduced the Aral Sea volume by 90% over the last 50 years. And if there's anywhere on the planet that you want to look for an example of a freshwater catastrophe and an increasing salinity of a basin, Aral Sea is certainly the place. As you'll see, these ships are located kilometers from the the original shore of the basin. And this is just a transition over the last 20 years from 1989 to 2008. If we looked at the historical basin, it's significantly larger, and it's really one of those things when you learn about it in detail, it brings tears to your eyes. There's a very small effort underway, there's an ongoing effort underway right now to take those basins at the very north part of the sea, now referred to as the Little Aral Sea, and dam them up and try to slowly build up water that's being rediverted back into the original river basins. But this is a long-term project. I hope that some of your grandchildren will live to see an Aral Sea that is coming back to life in some ways. Absolutely tragic, the Aral Sea example. Some other things to think about in terms of our problems is our unecological use of virtual water. So on the top left, this is a picture of Mali, where a number of multinationals have moved in to try to take advantage of irrigation in newly built canals. And you have a number of African women out there harvesting rice for the purpose of, in large part, to send to external markets. China, Senegal, maybe United States. This is an area that's extremely, extremely arid. Many of you have heard about Timbuktu, the great golden city of gold that was more or less buried underneath the dunes in intervening centuries. This is the same part of the world, and here we're growing a very water-intensive crop for the international market. In the center is California. I'm sure many of you have had California oranges, and many of you also know that a lot of that water is being diverted over hundreds and hundreds of miles in order to supply the virtual water that's contained in those waters, in those oranges. And finally, this is a picture from Namibia of what happens when you send your bottled water over long distances. You end up drinking the sand. Certainly an issue. As an aside, one trip I made to Namibia, I had the joy of getting a bottled water from a gas station that said, "This goes good with gin, tonic, or even by itself." So clearly Namibians have an appreciation for the variegated value of water. So the national, international, and global trade transfers of water from often dry rural areas to urban centers that may be in much more humid climates is really another one of those tragedies where we're taking from areas that don't have, and converting it and moving water by itself or within food products to places where they might actually have more water in their local environment. I also wanted to, of course, highlight the impacts of water pollution and water quality. To the left is a lake in China, the fourth largest in that country, that literally turned green in 2007. That's not an artificial colorization there. According to the Chinese, that was due to natural causes. I have not studied that lake directly to be able to speak from my own perspective, but I've never seen a natural lake with an algal bloom quite that green in my travels around the world. To the right is another picture of a fish kill, which may have been due to either toxics or anoxic conditions, or potentially even a waterborne disease, all of which are exacerbated by our pollution, etc. So these issues of water quality impairment are byproducts of our human, agricultural, and industrial metabolism, in the sense that we're over-fertilizing, we're contaminating our water, harming and killing life, and basically rendering our usable water useless. I'd like to now turn it over to Karin. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, Dan and I are going to be trading off here a bit to kind of talk about the problems and then go into the solutions. So Dan walked through in terms of the range of issues ranging from water quantity, quality issues that we're facing at a global scale, and then in some of the different regions as examples. And we need to basically, on top of that, put these other challenges that we're facing at a global level, and one of being population growth. The projections of population growth have changed and are at lower numbers than years ago when I worked actually on population issues many, many years ago. At that point, it was around 12, 15 billion by the year 2050. Now the estimates are 9 billion. But I don't know for many of you if that's something that makes you sleep really well at night. Thinking if you look at all the problems that Dan walked through, and we're going to be talking through here, if you think of all the problems we're experiencing right now, if you add in another 3 billion, around 3 billion people on top of that, what does that mean? In some sense, I'm always like, gosh, could we just freeze things where we are right now and fix them before we increase? But that's not going to happen. We have to figure out how do we have solutions that will take into account the population growth that is going to occur. Whether it is maybe even a re-estimate that could come along and say 2 billion, is still 2 billion in face of a population right now, as Dan pointed out, 1.3 billion without access to safe drinking water and 2.3 without sanitation. So just bear that in mind as we talk about solutions, thinking about solutions that will also take into account this population growth. And here actually is just a slide that kind of in one slide shows the range of problems from public health problems with actually waterborne diseases being the #1 killer for children to weak institutions. In many countries, it's the ministries of water, certainly the ministries of environment, but even the ministries of water, which are some of the weakest ministries. They're coming up against ministries of agriculture, ministries of energy, ministries of finance that are the ones really the powerhouses in countries. And the ministries of water, really, if you dig down, are not the ones who are making the big decisions on where infrastructure is built, how it's built. And as Dan also talked about, dilapidated and aging infrastructure being a major issue for us, certainly here in the United States and in other parts of the globe, in those areas that don't even have currently infrastructure. Certainly in many of the big cities around the globe, the mega cities, who are not even actually processing their wastewater right now, with most of that wastewater just going back into the rivers untreated. But the thing that I wanted to bring your attention to is actually the middle one, which is high costs, low prices, competing demands, financing gaps. I mean, we have all of these problems, but at the core oftentimes is, money comes as an issue, is how are we going to deal with these problems in a way in an economy, global economy right now, where people don't have a lot of cash to be throwing around. So when we talk about global solutions, we also need to talk about solutions that are at a scale that can be actually managed by, whether it's by companies, by utilities, by individuals, by countries, by municipalities. And how do we deal with the financing gaps that we have? So that's something to just keep in mind when we talk about solutions, is how do we propose solutions that will actually address and reduce that financial gap and provide long-term sustainable financial solutions as well. Oh, and just briefly, actually, the one thing I forgot to mention too when we talk about costs, for most of you who are probably living in this area, I mean, we pay our water bill in our house and living in this area is $30 a month. If you compare with our electricity bill, which usually is on average about $400 a month, and even then we don't have electricity most of the time thanks to Pepco. Sorry. In terms, I talked about population growth, the financing gap, and so forth. The other issue to raise in terms of when we talk about global problems is also urbanization. In 2008 was the first time in history where more of our population was in urban centers than in rural areas. We don't see that trend changing back. More and more people are moving to cities. And you can see here in terms of the global distribution of cities, for the most part, a lot of the major and mega cities are really along coastal areas. So not only are we dealing with issues in terms of how to manage resources to meet demands for these mega cities and these growing urban populations, but then what impacts does that have on the marine systems as well and the connection between freshwater and marine ecosystems? And here, actually, the prediction from the State of the World in '96 that the growth of cities will be the single largest influence on the development in the 21st century, which is not something that I think, certainly me as an environmentalist conservationist, I mean, most of us don't always think of problems as, well, cities is our biggest problem that we face when we talk about these issues. And then the State of the World report in 2007 saying the outstanding feature of urban population growth is that to the extent that it is growing, it's the poor. The numbers of people who are in these urban populations that are poor are growing. And if you factor in population growth, the growth is about 77 million people. Most of those are also poor. So we need to factor in when we talk about solutions, looking this in terms of urban centers being the dominant force for us in the next decades, but also the poor being the dominant population in those urban centers. And this here, taken from work that I did in Africa a long, long time ago, but the situation hasn't really changed in this area. To talk also about, when we talk about global solutions, which we're going to be talking about today, is also to remind ourselves that the implementation needs to be local. With whatever solution we talk at a global scale, water still is a very local issue. And you can see that in cases where, people come, raise alarm over scarcity in their areas and so forth, then, they're not really concerned about the next city over. They're thinking about their own issues today and tomorrow and their own family's issues. As with this woman, it's her real day in life is, how am I going to provide for my family for water? And so when we talk about solutions, let's remind ourselves also to talk about the people who have to deal with these issues and how can these solutions be implemented at local scales. I talked about population growth, and there's not just, and here in the middle is growing demand for water, but also when we talk about population growth, we need to keep in the back of our minds, it's also this population growth will factor in water for other areas. So agriculture, a big issue right now being discussed is food security. How do we feed 9 billion people, and of course water being the main source for most crops, how do we take that into account when we're talking about how to improve and increase agricultural production? In some areas, it's rain-fed agriculture, but that's not the solution that can be in all areas, so we need to take that into account. And also timber, wood fuel being a source of fuel for a third of the world's population. And as we're losing forests, what does that mean for watersheds? There is an interplay between forested areas and water quantity as well, and something that I'll talk about in the solutions. But it's something to think about as population demands, urban demands, all of these demands are placed on water. It's not just in the water that we drink or use every single day, but it's also the water that we use through agricultural products, through timber that is harvested as well. This slide is actually taken from Peru. It's an asparagus farm, actually, where one of our partners was doing some work just actually early last year. And this, when Dan was talking about trade in water, most of this asparagus actually makes its way to the United States and to Europe. And you can see here it's a little bit starker picture of realizing what is this in terms of its scale, in terms of water resources. The water table here is actually dropping about 10 feet per year. And the issue here to keep in mind is that it's not, we're not saying these issues just for water itself, but it's also an economic point of view. I mean, this is not a sustainable business here that we're describing here. And so how do we take that into account when we're looking at solutions to these issues? This slide, I have a few slides that I threw in here that I kind of cute-ish, but hopefully to send a strong message. And I included this one here as I come from a conservation organization and a long-time environmentalist. Actually, my point with this slide is not to say that it's, the fish are out of water for the sake of the fish, but it's really also the economic impacts. When we're losing aquatic biodiversity, we're also losing economies. Some of the work that some of the scientists we have been doing in terms of looking at hydropower dams and the downstream impacts of these dams is actually loss of fisheries, loss of economies. And that has implications in terms of a country's growth and its potential, and also where people can get sustainable livelihoods from. And so this is just something to keep in mind here is also, of course, we care about the aquatic biodiversity for aquatic biodiversity, which is critical, but also link it to the economy as well. This one I include in here because as Dan talked quite a bit about climate change, there's so much discussion right now about, well, we have climate change, it's coming, we need more storage. And the natural tendency is to just build more traditional type of storage systems. Let's build, hydroelectric dam, let's build a storage system. But these systems and these approaches need to take into account future projections and also need to take into account perhaps solutions like green infrastructure. We have long history, particularly here in the United States, of traditional infrastructure, hard infrastructure, concrete infrastructure, but there are natural solutions out there that can help improve water resource management and also supply water for people and also for businesses, so something to keep in mind. And then this slide just put out here, there was the, I can't remember who actually said the original one in terms of a drop of water that reaches, a freshwater, that drop of water that reaches the sea is a wasted drop of water. And someone who's been working on these issues for quite a while, you think that mindset might have changed so that people understand we need sufficient quantities of water in our systems, not only for nature and biodiversity, but for the economies, for people. Actually, someone in a government agency said that to me a few weeks ago. Actually, I won't name the person, I won't name even the country of the government agency, but it's just a reminder that we're not in a mindset yet that has completely changed, where everyone really appreciates the scale of the problems we're dealing with on freshwater, and also understanding that we need to find solutions that think about these things in the ways that look at the long-term sustainable financing, look at economic livelihoods, but also ensuring that we have freshwater ecosystems and healthy freshwater ecosystems for the long term. So that is actually a run-through Dan and I had of some of the kind of global scale problems. And Dan asked you in the beginning to not jot down or put in your head some thoughts. We're going to just pause here for a moment, and just if there are those of you who'd like to share some other larger scale problems that we maybe haven't touched upon that we really should think about as we then go into the next section, which is really focused in on solutions. There is a mic. Okay. There's one over here. Okay. Oh, there's another mic over here, too. Okay, great.
I was just going to bring up the link between energy production and water, particularly as China and India have more thermal power plants that are going to have increased needs for cooling and things like that. So it could potentially generate some conflicts, not necessarily, but potentially.
Definitely, that's true.
I just also wanted to bring up a point that came across to me fairly recently. Also, the amount of beef consumption per individual in the world, let alone the number of individuals in the world, is increasing. And in order to produce beef from the crops that are fed to the beef, with processing as well and transport, quite a vast amount of water is also used that is taking away from the freshwater supply.
Others out there who, I think, right back here.
Yeah, I noted freshwater fish as food. I mean, we talked about biodiversity and kind of freshwater as habitat, and also linked with that as invasive species, sometimes for profit, like Nile perch and Lake Vic.
That's very true.
Hello, I'm interested in the financial aspects, both public finance and private investment, of keeping water clean moving forward.
Great, okay.
This might have been covered on your summary slide a couple slides back, but inequity in global supplies. You mentioned the cost for $30, I guess, in D.C. for water.
Right.
Oftentimes that's much higher if you're getting your water off of a truck or some other delivery system. And then groundwater supplies, I think you touched on, but a lack of data on consumption of groundwater supplies. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts? I don't know, Tom, did you also want to? And then later, okay. Randy, and then?
Yeah, the tremendous loss rate in cities of water in broken pipes. Some cities, even in the U.S., as much as 40-50%.
I think one of the big problems in the United States especially is that water is actually pretty cheap for us. It's very inexpensive, so people, like you were saying, your water bill is $30. I mean, it's only $30, whereas electricity is a little higher. So you're more likely to, say, turn off your lights than you are to turn off the faucet while you're brushing your teeth, because it's really not that expensive. So it would be like externalities cost. And I think that they should charge more for water.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have more time. We're going to run through some proposed global solutions, and then we're going to have time to come back to these additions and have more of your thoughts as well. But exactly those issues in terms of water energy linkages, invasive species, financing, in terms of infrastructure. There's things we need to take into account as we talk about solutions. And we're going to talk a few about some global solutions right now. Before that, I just wanted to touch upon some international processes. At the global scale, there's different meetings that happen. There was the Bonn conference in 2001, and actually later this year will be Bonn plus 10. There was the 5th World Water Forum in Istanbul in 2009. There will be the next 6th World Water Forum in Marseille next year in March of 2012. And we had the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg in 2002, and the Rio plus 20 Earth Summit will be next year in May in Rio. So it's just to keep in mind that there are opportunities at a global level where people do come together to talk about these issues. These processes, though, really depend on people bringing their own solutions that are working. And how can you form partnerships to scale up these solutions? And these processes, these conferences, the challenge is, and we've seen this even in the climate area, I mean, it's difficult to get all governments to agree to something, particularly as they start focusing on language and nitpicking which word. And, I've been in processes where governments have said, well, we don't want even to refer to the term ecosystems. So that's challenging. How do you get to a point where a government says, well, we don't want the word ecosystems in there? But that government, I know, because I know that government, which is the one we were dealing with, actually, in their country, there's so many different programs and activities that they're doing in terms of improving water resource management that could be scaled up at broader scales. So again, I just wanted to bring this as an opportunity where people can come together and form partnerships and advance solutions, whether they are tested in terms of very local solutions, but then they could be replicated at bigger scales. The three that I'm going to focus in on, actually the first one is market-based mechanisms, which is water funds. And actually it was a local solution that is being replicated throughout Latin America and the Caribbean and now also into other regions. I will also talk about integrated water resource management or integrated river basin management also as a solution that is at a larger scale. And then also different incentive approaches that have arisen as businesses and the private sector understand that they're facing real challenges and risks in their own operations, and how can they address those through the Alliance for Water Stewardship and the creation of a first global water certification program. So just briefly, as one of these water funds, the idea of a water fund is basically you are setting up a mechanism through which downstream water users pay for protection of the upper watershed. It's really a payment for environmental service scheme approach. The Conservancy joined forces with USAID and a number of partners 10 years ago to do this in Quito, Ecuador, with a population of over 2 million people that depend on water from the Condor Biosphere Reserve. And so the idea is you're channeling these funding resources in-country, they're in-country funding resources for long-term protection of the watershed so that the citizens of Quito can ensure having supply for the long term, and also the businesses that are in the Quito. The Quito case study started with about $21,000 of startup funding. There's actually, this number is a little bit old. We're actually about $8 million in a trust fund, and the interest from this trust fund is used for improvements and protection of the upper watershed, which range from working with farmers on best management practices, working to support the protected area system upon which Quito depends, so park guards for that system, community education programs, reforestation programs. So in essence, creating a finance mechanism that is sustainable, a local finance mechanism that is not dependent in long term on donor funding and can really ensure protection of that watershed. The other interesting thing here, you'll see some of the partners involved in this, and for me, as in coming from a governance area, I think it's really exciting because it's creating a governance mechanism through which these partners then work together. So you basically have the municipal government, you have the hydroelectric company, you have NGOs and others working together on this approach. When we say scaling this up, we're right now in the process of scaling this up to 13 sites across Latin America with the goal of 32 water funds across Latin America and the Caribbean, and looking to explore this concept in other parts of the world, including Africa. So again, it's a solution that occurs in terms of the scale of Quito, but it's a solution that can be taken to other geographies and really replicated across the globe. The other kind of solution in terms of when we talk about global solutions that I just wanted to mention is just something because of our involvement I know more about is actually the concept of integrated river basin management. And at the World Summit in 2002, all countries agreed to develop integrated water resource management plans. Many countries have either developed them or are in the process of developing them. The challenge with integrated water resource management then is it's a big undertaking. It's how to get the agricultural sector talking to the industrial sector, talking to the municipal governments, talking with the finance, energy, all the different players. It's quite a challenge for countries to do. One approach is to look at it at a river basin scale in terms of integrated river basin management. So trying to get it right at least at a river basin scale and maybe taking how that happens and then replicating it across the country or across larger regions. So the work that we've been doing actually quite a bit on is in the Mississippi to get one vision for the Mississippi, because right now the upper Mississippi and the lower Mississippi really function separately. And the idea is to create one vision for the Mississippi. We're working in the Yangtze River as well. We've been working in the Zambezi, the Magdalena in Colombia, and the Paraná-Paraguay River in Brazil. And again, this is through private partners and public partners, the Caterpillar being a key one as part of this, but the U.S. Geological Survey, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, NGOs as well. And the idea is coming together to really focus in on integrated river basin management. It's a long-term process, but with these solutions, I think one of the things that I want to make sure is emphasized is none of these things will happen without partnerships. The other thing, too, is keeping in mind is there's not just one solution that fits all. So when we talk about integrated river basin management in the Mississippi, that's not something that will look exactly the same, and you can just say, well, this is how it's done in the Yangtze. But you can do a lot in terms of sharing the expertise. So one of the things that's been going on is actually scientific exchanges between the Yangtze and the Mississippi in terms of monitoring of aquatic biodiversity. So how do you improve monitoring of aquatic species that can help inform improved decision-making processes? And through this is actually, the thing that I really focus in on that is it's a real trust-building process. I mean, water can be a very contentious, of course, issue, and part of what we're working at Global Solutions is building trust among institutions and organizations, whether it's a partnership between a government agency or an NGO, or between private sector and NGO, or all three of them. It's the importance is building that trust and that experience working together. The last one that I'm going to touch upon before turning back over to Dan is the Alliance for Water Stewardship. This is something that we've been involved in with a number of other partners for the last several years. And again, I made the point, there is no one solution. There's no silver bullet. I know we all wish there could be some silver bullet to global water challenges. But what we have is different solutions that can be replicated at different scales, by different partners through different funding mechanisms. And the Alliance for Water Stewardship is really an effort to create the first global water certification program to really look at social, environment, and economic in terms of all three, the triple bottom line. There is a precedent. Many of you obviously know about the Forestry Stewardship Council, the Marine Stewardship Council, LEEDs, other different agricultural certification programs. And when we were getting involved in this early on, the question was, is there something in water? And there is no certification program in water. And so the point was to join forces with partners, knowing that this has to be done through partnerships to create what we sometimes call the Forestry Stewardship Council for Water. But it's different. The water sector is not the forestry sector. And part of this is also learning the experiences from these other certification programs. What's worked, what's not worked, how can we build that in as we build this global certification program, which will be aimed at large water users and water utilities. In building out this, right now our focus over the next 2 years is actually to develop the performance standards. That is really the base. These are going to be voluntary standards by which companies and utilities would get certified as being sustainable water stewards. So the focus over the next several years is developing the performance standards and pilot testing them, but also building out the overall structure of the stewardship scheme, which involves third-party certification, marketing, and branding, and is also multi-stakeholder governance is critical. So it's really a process to build out what will be at a global scale. And partly what I was actually talking to a number of TNC staff about this yesterday, and the thing that I really emphasized to them was my own organization, we cannot work in every single river basin across the globe. We just will never have the capacity or the financial resources. But we can be part of a partnership to create a mechanism like this that companies and utilities in countries where we will never work could actually get certified. So hopefully improving water resource management in a way, in a vehicle that each individual organization doesn't feel like they have to set up offices in each country or hire staff in each country. We're really giving a tool through which this can be done at a global scale, regional and local scale. Just quickly in terms of the performance-driven standards, this is what the standards will be looking at. As I said, we're developing them over the next 2 years. The impact categories is what we've agreed upon in terms of trying to address ecosystems, human health, social and cultural well-being, and economic use. And also the benefits for different stakeholders to why to get involved in this. As I said, I think I've said several times, water is a local issue. With the development of the Alliance for Water Stewardship and Water Certification Program, you cannot ever bring together, let's say, 10 companies or 15 companies to one meeting and capture 60 or 70% of the global market, which you can do in some other sectors. So the important piece for this is also regional engagement. There are regional initiatives in Australia and Europe that were underway. In Latin America, we helped launch that last year. In North America, we just launched that with the Milwaukee Water Council. There's work underway in Africa. Asia and Middle East is actually an area that we're exploring to make sure it's well represented. But the idea being is even for something that is a global solution, like the Alliance for Water Stewardship and Water Certification, it depends on regional engagement and regional involvement. And just my last point here is we're in the process right now of forming an International Standards Development Committee, calling out to you if you know of experts who would like to be involved in the standards development process over the next several years. But again, to be part of something that's through a large partnership, a multi-stakeholder process to create something that will be applicable at a global scale.
Thank you, Karin. In our last portion on solutions, I'd like to move from some of the specific and ongoing activities that we're doing to look at a more prospective look in the future, particularly governance issues, techno fixes, if you want, and some demographic issues. First, though, I wanted to make sure to point out two of my favorite national level activities. South Africa, which to the best of my knowledge is the only country to provide a constitutional right to water. Everyone has a right to have access to sufficient food and water. This was recently actually argued in the Supreme Court of South Africa, where some citizens within the local disadvantaged slum area challenged how much water they should have to be sufficient. So it's actually withheld. The Constitutional Court withheld the right to a certain amount of water, but not to the luxury water that had been taken by that particular community. Also in Brazil, under Lula, the Semsede, hopefully Paulo can tell me if I pronounced that wrong, No Thirst campaign. Did I do okay? Okay. Fantastic. I haven't practiced that one, which, again, was a fantastic example of taking the whole idea of human needs for water and reducing it to 2 words, which does a lot better than a lot of the global plans and projects out there. I would add that although Brazil was focusing on human no thirst, this certainly applies just as much to those species with whom we share a planet. Now, there's also the global scale response. One of our colleagues, Alcamo, in German, has pointed out that we need an increase in global water system understanding. Even though, as Karin said, all of these challenges are local in implementation, in the end we have one interconnected water system, as I pointed out at the beginning, and we don't completely understand how it all works, how it's being affected by our activities, by natural and human-induced climate changes, for example, and therefore there's real need for continued close observation at various different scales, experimentation at the local, regional, and larger scales, and simulation of what may be happening under various contexts and scenarios. In addition, there's a need to look at expanding the complementarity of global water governance and by complementarity, I mean in association or complementary to local and national level governance. Essentially, where we have virtual water flows, where we have payment for services that are very far away from where the end user may be, how can we develop water governance systems to support that? So agreements about environmental flows, for example, how much water should flow between one country and another. My experience with the Tigris-Euphrates River Basin planning has made very clear that Turkey has a monopoly on upstream water, and Syria and Iraq are very much dependent on the decisions that are made in Turkey. How do we set up appropriate environmental flows to support both the people and the natural needs of those basins? Efficiency standards, which Karin talked about, and labeling of products such as your washing machine, your dishwasher, things like that, are ways that we can bring forward the importance of water governance at a global scale, even as implemented within different nation states. And finally, we need to challenge some of our assumptions about water needs. My experience living in Japan for a year was very interesting in the sense that, on the one hand, they have the most high-tech toilets on the planet. By far, I mean, they can sing music to you. You could probably do karaoke in some Japanese toilets. Meanwhile, they have holes in the ground right next door at a neighboring building. Here we tend to run the shower for as long as it takes to keep it hot and enjoy it. Whereas by contrast, in that country, a whole family may use one tub of bath water in a given evening. So what are our needs for water relative to our desires is certainly an issue that we'll be challenging ourselves with as we move from 7 to 9 or even 15 billion people on the planet. World Wildlife Fund also emphasized in its recent study of climate and water management the need for vulnerability and climate risk assessments at all different scales. Can we figure out where are the places that are most likely to be impacted by climate change, and then focus down on where there are the resources and the political will to really try to protect and restore the freshwater ecosystems that upon which we depend. In addition, WWF emphasized the need to build the institutional capacity for adaptive water resource management, which essentially overlays on what Karin's comments about participatory multi-stakeholder governance with the idea that we don't know what the future is going to be like. We have a good idea what things might be like in a year or 2 years, but really as we look out at the time scale of infrastructure development, we have to be ready to be nimble in terms of the changes that climate and other natural, environmental, and artificial factors may cause. Sandro Postel, who unfortunately couldn't make it here today, also has identified a few big solutions which I thought it would be worth emphasizing, since she's the National Geographic Fellow on freshwater, and I'm not. Notably, we need to grow more food with less virtual water, meaning irrigating more efficiently. We've seen a lot of humid climates. In developing countries, the food production efficiency is much, much lower for the same level of water resource inputs from precipitation, etc. How can we impact that and make irrigation more efficient? To boost yields on rain-fed lands, an associated challenge. To choose less water-intensive diets. I think one of our participants here made an adequate example with beef relative to grains as storage points for virtual water. And finally, to use trade to make the smartest use of local water. Are we really subsidizing the cost of bringing water interregionally or of protecting water from coming into one region? Or is there a way that we can take those away and come up with a smarter approach to our water usage and transfer? In terms of looking forward into the future, she also emphasizes the reduction of maladaptive subsidies. On the one side, there's the subsidies for water use. On the other side, there's the subsidies for things like flood insurance, that in the United States we have this national flood insurance supporting people to live in flood zones at a time when we know that these dynamics are going to be changing very dramatically, is probably not the best idea. We need to restore natural river flows via dam redesign and renewal, an effort that's been underway since the World Commission on Dams came out with its report a few years ago. and encourage green infrastructure, as I'll show you in a few moments, in metropolitan areas. And finally, of course, the participatory decision-making that Karin emphasized before. Now, I'm an ecologist by training, so I really like to think about biomimicry. How can we act like the animals? If Dr. Doolittle could talk to them, how can we emulate them? So, for example, like forests, can we capture green water into green infrastructure? In this case, this is a hypothetical urban area where essentially everything is green. Now, I'm not a big fan of Kentucky bluegrass as the only green cover, but at least the implication is there that we can be storing and capturing and creating green water for our crops, for our nature, and for ourselves. Like our own kidneys, can we recycle gray water and black water at the domestic household level as well as the regional scale? Some of you may or may not know that we're just across the way from one of the most interesting experiments in the U.S. In terms of water recycling, which is that the black water, which comes in at the top of the Occoquan watershed, actually goes 3 miles, 5 miles downstream and goes into an intake and becomes water for the same population. So it's one of the few places on the planet where you're downstream from yourself or upstream from yourself, depending on how you look at it. And that sort of recycling, when taken to large scales, could be very efficient in terms of essentially recycling the water through the community. Like salt marsh grasses, we could also be doing a bit more desalination or desalination. Now, challenge there, of course, is that we're using greenhouse gas emitting fuels a lot of times to run those industries, and therefore we're going to have to figure out some creative ways to do that using renewables, lest we contribute to the climate change issue. And finally, some of you may have heard recently that we think we found an extremophile in one of the California lakes that actually is using arsenic as part of its basic metabolism. The idea of decontaminating our water and possibly finding other uses for those contaminants is certainly exciting. And one of my colleagues at George Mason University has actually come up with a low-cost way to take arsenic out of groundwater that can be implemented using local technology and resources, which we're looking forward to seeing having a very profound impact on the water access, healthy water access in places like Bangladesh, which has a high arsenic level. Just a couple of pretty pictures. So this is an example, not yet built, but of one of these green roof communities or green infrastructure. Here is a commercial scale solar project plan for Atlantic City, where essentially you have commercial scale wind turbines running the whole system. They're running they're using on-site power to treat their wastewater. Again, this might be a thing we could connect to desalination as well. In the household, you can imagine using your sink and that water being used directly for your toilet, or heck, run your dishwasher, your clothes washing machine, and then go to the bathroom. Or throw that part out altogether and just look at a compostable toilet. We actually have one of those running now on a ship in the James River in Virginia, which essentially is a zero-emitting ship, vehicle that's being used for showing people about the watershed. It goes up and down the James River, and everyone can use the compostable zero-waste toilet there. This is just an example of a gray water system design. The idea is you separate your potentially pathogen affected black water from your gray water and then put it to good use out in your yard. So just another example of zero discharge on-site wastewater treatment. Again, you're basically creating a closed loop from what has traditionally been a linear process of use and flush. Of course, the overall goal, thinking like an ecologist, is how can we connect our use of water and fresh water in with the ecosystems and as well use ecosystems in a way that's applied to help us deal with our own pollution and solutions. And this is an example of a living machine where essentially the organisms and the plants in this system essentially are helping to clean up the water that comes in from your toilet, from your sink, from your animals, so that it can be put back out and into some of the same resources as well as crops on the other end. Now, the coolest endpoint of this is a net zero water project where you're harvesting, treating, and reusing water on site. Now, that just sounds like right after you get your solar cells installed on your house, this might be the next thing you want to do. And the Bullitt Foundation's Cascadia Center for Sustainable Design and Construction is actually looking into making this a reality. Very last, I'd like to talk about very briefly demographic considerations. Pretty controversial, but Dr. Lovejoy challenged us to kind of have some big ideas. One is as we get these subsidies reduced for people living in floodplains and bringing water to places where there is no natural water to support those populations, could we possibly allow people to migrate to climates where they can afford to thrive? So we really, instead of keeping people in places where drought is rampant or where floods are expected, actually to allow people to move some places like the area around Lake Baikal, if it was acceptable, where essentially the water resources can support the populations we're talking about, bring people to the water instead of water to the people. And second, the issue of promoting zero population growth as okay at ethnic, national, global scales. A recent article I saw within the last week or two was talking about Japan's population crisis. Oh no, our population is going down. So even at a global scale where we're worried about this, the countries that are actually achieving what we consider to be effective are saying, wait, we need to have more population. We need to create daycare centers. We need to do everything we can to have more people in our country. And as long as there's that tension between, at a national scale, we need more people, but at the global scale, we need to reduce that, I think we're going to have a bit of a problem addressing all of our environmental issues, and particularly those dealing with freshwater. So now that Karin and I have shared some of our ideas, we have about a little under an hour in which we'd like to invite all of you to share some of your solutions you might have been thinking of to the problems we raised or you may have raised. We'll also take any questions or comments you'd like to have about this issue. So any big solutions in your heads or questions or comments? Could we start maybe with Dr. Lovejoy? Thank you.
So I have just two first reactions. One is, we did touch on the importance of freshwater biodiversity, but the reality is most people think of water as something that's a substance, not a living ecosystem, and that comes out of a tap. They don't even connect it to the energy that pushes it to come out of the tap, or if it's an elevated temperature that warms it. And there are some important things to realize about biodiversity and freshwater systems. One is that the natural biodiversity is basically the best measure of the health of the ecosystem. This is work that goes back to the mid-1940s by Ruth Patrick, who's still chugging along at 103. And perhaps separately memorialized by W.C. Fields, who said he didn't drink water because fish do certain things in it. But Baikal has extraordinary biodiversity, not just an endemic seal, but probably the largest group of closely related species growing together, a big biological puzzle. The other comment I want to make is how important being thoughtful about water issues can be in moving often very tension-filled relationships between countries to a much more collaborative approach. My own personal example was visiting Cyprus as a Fulbright fellow, the 50th anniversary of Fulbright, spending more time there than originally planned, and pretty quickly realizing that Cyprus had a terrible groundwater problem. They were basically drawing down groundwater across the island, and the only solution to that would be if North and South Cyprus worked on it together. And I remember calling Tim Wirth, who then was the Undersecretary of Global Affairs or whatever it was, Global Issues, at the State Department, and like that, it became a dominant priority for U.S. diplomacy. And Tom Pickering, who I talked with about this, had real experience doing the same thing when he was ambassador to Israel, dealing with the Jordan River. So that's one of the really important things that can be done, and there's an interesting example right now as the terrible situation in Haiti, albeit being dealt with by some international organizations, it's actually causing some of the population to spill over into the Dominican Republic and produce some deforestation. Well, it turns out all the major rivers of Haiti originate in those forested watersheds. So that then becomes something that one needs to think about, at least at the binational level. So there are a lot of positive things that can come in terms of international relations by working on some of these water issues that cross borders. And so I think I'll leave it at that, and we'd love to hear what all of you are thinking.
While you think about this, let me add one thing specific about Brazil. You know, in Brazil there is a joke that we make our own rain, which is not a joke, it's true. It has to do with the Amazon. The Amazon makes its own rain. There has been a lot of progress in the way people, if you compare to the Rio 92 to now, the people, this issue it belongs to Brazilian society. It was not like that 20 years ago. There are, as you know, Brazil has two very important, that are more connected and known because it's connection with water, which is the Amazon and the Pantanal, just immediately to the south of it. And there is also another system that is called the Guarani Aquifer in the south of the country, crucial for agriculture. Now, you have positive experiences, like things that actually, some of those dialogues happen here with farmers from Mato Grosso and other areas really incorporating or understanding the importance of preserving the Amazon for their own business. They need the water. What makes Brazilian agriculture very efficient, one of the factors, is free water brought to us from São Pedro, as we believe. And it's a very important process. There are challenges, like the whole discussion you see now of the use of the Amazon to produce hydro. There are 3 major dams, and actually the largest one is actually going ahead, which is Belo Monte. Now, there are positive, there are those challenging examples, there are the positive examples of the Sensede program, and there are other things that agribusiness seems to be, or at least part of it, seems to be looking for solutions. As you know, it takes a lot of water to produce ethanol, but you have sugarcane ethanol, but you can recycle a lot of that water, and it's happening because people understand the problem, see the pressures, the political pressures, and there are solutions. So it is another potentially positive story, is that you can produce green energy from sugarcane, increasing yields and reusing part of the water that is used in that process. So actually using the water from the sugarcane juice for other purposes. I just wanted to add this dimension here, and so if we have comments, questions, yes.
I wanted to follow up on something that Karin was talking about, and sort of under the rubric that you can't manage what you can't measure, or you mismanage what you mismeasure. You talked about sustainable forestry certification programs, which are underlined by a series of criteria and indicators, including biodiversity and so on. Are we moving, in terms of sustainable water management, to some international set of measures, criteria, indicators, anything like that, so that we can in fact measure progress towards sustainability in water management.
Do you want me? Should I answer? Or
Go ahead.
do you want Okay. No, it's definitely that's been one challenge with the work in creation of this water stewardship certification scheme. The approach has really been to develop performance standards so that you're not really saying how a company or utility will do something, but the standards to which they should try and achieve. So that's something the scientists have been working on. There are certainly areas of the globe where there's data gaps, but it's one of those things that we often talk about, data gaps in water, but if you dig deeper, there are many different agencies, from the UN agencies to conservation organizations. WWF has had huge efforts in working with the Conservancy on data, improving data management and data availability on water resources. So I think we're getting there. We're not entirely there, but part of the effort with the Alliance for Water Stewardship is to really help spur that. So you're creating a set of principles, criteria, and standards that are accepted through a multi-stakeholder process, and then it will be up to the companies and utilities how then they achieve those standards. So that process is really underway, and hopefully is a spur to keep improving that, because I still think we have a long way to go, but I think sometimes we sell ourselves short, that there is far more out there. It's sometimes it's not as readily available. Some of the countries that I know where we've been working, we've tried to access data, and some of the government agencies just won't turn it over. So part of that is also that negotiation, trust-building exercise of how do you actually can get access to that information that does exist. But I think we have a long way to go, but the idea with this is to create one, at least, approach tool so that'll push us in that direction.
Just to follow up, the certification program then is not an actual tool for gauging, say, the quality, or it's not a tool for water footprinting for various sectors. It's actually a grading scheme for processes, for participatory approaches and the like.
Well, we actually have a memorandum of understanding with the Water Footprint Network. So the work of the water accountancy, I didn't put up one slide I have, which really focuses on the work around water footprinting, where companies are basically assessing their footprint. That does feed into what we're looking at in terms of the certification scheme. But the certification scheme would look at issues of a company and its utility in terms of what they're doing around water quality, water quantity, and other areas in terms of integrated water resource management, social equity. So there will be a whole set of standards looking at kind of all these different issues. But the main aim of it is really to see real measured improvements in the watershed. So it's a tool to get companies and utilities to change their practices, change what they're doing in their own operations, but also operations along a whole watershed, so that you can really see real improvements in that watershed in the long term.
And I actually had a sort of an unrelated question about solutions, if I could. The solutions that came at the end of the presentations, many of them seem to be targeted towards more developed countries, technologies that you could deploy, say, in your home or business, in sort of the built environment. I was wondering if, and I guess for the whole panel, if you could touch on technologies, solutions that might be more appropriate for developing countries. Great, thanks.
Any other question?
The solutions actually were more focused at developed countries. And what about solutions for actually developing countries?
With what?
The one that you were showing the examples. They're very focused at developed countries. But how about using those or other examples for developing?
Yes, sorry about that. I have a hearing problem, so I apologize if I answer the wrong question. Bear with me. The solutions in developed countries that can be applied to developing countries in particular, or which solutions which are specific to developing countries? Sorry about that.
Sorry. I guess my initial question, and I guess if you could answer this in any way you'd like. The question I had was directed towards creating solutions that perhaps were appropriate for areas where we aren't dealing with a built environment, where perhaps there isn't funding for example, a fully green net zero building, but in fact the problems of scarcity are very basic, and that there perhaps isn't funding available to create some of these more innovative technology-based solutions.
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask Karin to repeat the question in full volume. I apologize.
So The solutions that you were showing, the different green building and the different the net zero, those really are focused at developed countries.
Yeah, okay.
And could those be, what kind of solutions would be in the more developing context where they don't have that kind of building?
Yeah. Actually, I think it's actually somewhat easier to do in developing countries because we have a lot of building standards in developed countries which actively work to prevent some of these solutions, if I may say so. For example, at George Mason Arlington campus, the thought of building a green roof onto a building is a real traumatic thing. Like, how can we afford these sorts of things? Whereas if you have a community where rainwater capture is really intrinsic to the survival of that community in an arid environment, for example, you do it. I mean, we have numerous examples of small-scale villages of where your roof is acting to funnel water into rain barrels, and that's much, I would say, in a number of communities and cultures is actually much more prevalent than we'd find here in suburban Washington, D.C., for example. The actual harvesting on rooftops and vertical agricultural opportunities are being explored in China and other places in Southeast Asia, where the precipitation is there, but it moves through very quickly, monsoon seasons, et cetera. And how can you capture that in a vertical way? So I think it is being implemented in some cases very low-tech ways that could be scaled up, and where national building standards of developed countries might actually slow down the process to a certain extent.
Dan, I'd like to offer one example of solution in developing countries, or some that I know in terms of water use for people in cities. We were talking about this just now. In Brazil, for years, ages, ever, you don't heat water in a water tank and keep it all day heating. You heat only the water you're going to use. So you use less energy and, I assume, less water. The systems are available here now, and I don't understand why cities and states have not. I would not dare thinking about the federal government regulating that, because then there would be, some new charges of socialism, maybe. But maybe cities could probably, and I want to understand why this is not done. Why Montgomery County, where I live, don't give incentives for people to switch and have a schedule for making for water tanks becoming something that will exist only at the Smithsonian Institution here in the exhibits.
So I'd like to comment on that specifically. I mean, the hurdle there is the initial investment, but I actually did that in my house. So I have on-demand hot water, and my electric bill dropped by like 50%.
So it pays for itself.
Yeah, eventually. So I'd like to give an example from the Peruvian highlands, some communities in really pretty arid environments where there nonetheless are spring sources of water. And it's truly transformative to these communities to just do something as simple as have the water piped downhill, gravity fed, no energy cost, so that there is potable water in the houses. It introduces levels of hygiene that have never been there before. So it's hugely transformative to the well-being of the people. And in addition, most of that water in the past used to be lost to evaporation on the way to tiny little agricultural plots, and now it comes down in a pipe and essentially allows them to have 10 times the agricultural productivity. Really very modest investment and totally transformative.
I would point out also one of our colleagues at George Mason, John Liu, has put together a very poignant example of this landscape approach to capturing water and putting it to good use. In the case of the lowest plateau in China, which had basically been under unsustainable agricultural practices for a sustained period of time, to the point where a number of the subcatchments of the plateau had been essentially denuded of vegetation and useless for agriculture. And over a period of about 10 to 15 years, they went and terraced the area, brought in, revegetated, and there's a very poignant point in his film where he shows the exact same shot 12 years with a 12-year difference, and it goes from barren wasteland to productive agricultural land with also integrated, restored, if you want, vegetation, and that's at hopeandachangingclimate.org. Very, very clear how you can take the human capital, human labor, and take a situation that looks as bad as Haiti from space, and transform it into something where people are able to use it productively, and where nature is coming back into those environments.
I guess we should have been asking people to identify themselves.
Yeah, Churchill, Bethesda, Maryland. With population increase, you are not just have a human need, you have industry use, and you have agriculture. But the problem is this: the fresh water is finite, so that's still not enough. Why not we look the ocean? Yeah, desalination the water, so make. And second, another thing is this: now there's urbanization is intensified. I don't know how much the city use the groundwater, and if the final place use groundwater, maybe the city going to think. Have people think about this?
So I'd just like to put something before my colleagues respond to that, because they're much more expert at all of this than I. But there's really important aspect in your question in terms of agriculture. And basically all human agriculture, with a couple almost sort of indigenous people exceptions, have been based around crops that need fresh water. And there are some potential crops that already exist that actually grow well in salt water. There's one in the Gulf of California. And so I think one of the things we're going to be seeing in terms of development of new crops are development of crops which are much more tolerant of salinity than most of what we've used so far.
I would say, first of all, that I agree that water is a finite resource at any given moment in time, but it's that the consumptive water use that's directly associated with agriculture that's probably the biggest threat to reduction of that. Beyond that, we have a question of essentially, is the cost to clean it, for example, in a coastal area, or is the cost to clean water for reuse cheaper or more expensive than the cost to desalinate, to take out the salinity from coastal waters directly in estuaries or in open water? And I think as time goes on, our technology is getting better and better to where desalination makes sense in a lot of cases, particularly small island states and small islands like down in Puerto Rico. Some of the smaller islands are already using desalination. Clearly in the Middle East, we're seeing that pop up in a number of very dry areas. And so, if it's cheaper to convert seawater than to clean your fresh water, I think that you'll see that transition happening more and more rapidly. Again, the challenge here is that the ultimate cost there is one that of energy. What energy do you use, how much energy do you have available, and what are you willing to use for its environmental impacts, and then the overall environmental impacts of taking salt out of a system. Where does the salt go after that? How do you use it? How does that affect the local habitats? In a case where you're in a hyper-urban area anyways, there might not be a lot of biota to keep going, or habitats, but ideally you want to be sensitive to those issues. On the second question of urban urbanization and the use of groundwater, I think we could find a number of examples where groundwater is being unsustainably harvested for purposes of urban and metropolitan areas. In the long term, we've seen numerous cities, if not entire civilizations, disappear because of those actions. And eventually, I think in the centennial scale, that will balance out. The question right now is, do you figure out a way to subsidize those cities? Los Angeles is a great example where essentially water is being brought from thousands of miles away. Certainly there are examples in other parts of the world. That's one of the more poignant examples in our country where there's not a lot to get from the groundwater. So I think we're not relying on the surface water, then we're in trouble in some time frame. Groundwater doesn't cover it in a lot of those places.
The only thing I just wanted to add to that, too, is in your comment, something that is also, through your comment, is also the issue of planning of infrastructure. And we haven't really talked here yet about kind of more large-scale planning, which is really needed. Many infrastructure projects are really done on a site-by-site basis. Environmental impact assessments are done on a site-by-site basis and project to project. But our planning processes, I'm not a planner, but in terms of looking at how planning processes are done very poorly, they're not done at scales where these decisions of agriculture, energy, water are really taken into account as a kind of whole combined mix of what are our different options. So one of the things that we've been or others have been trying to advance is the idea of like strategic environmental assessments. So you look at an entire region in terms of water and energy, and you make decisions on, do you put hydropower dams here, or you put them there? Do you put other types of infrastructure here? Where are areas that have such high rates of biodiversity that you really don't want to lose those areas? So really moving toward planning processes that are larger scales so that we avoid these mistakes that are just driven by just a very narrow look of, okay, let's put something here, but then it creates a problem, let's say 10 kilometers downstream. So I think that's also, when we talk about solutions, one thing to advance also is this idea of a more broader scale of planning processes.
Here, let's go here first and then go there.
Dan Lieberman. Yeah, I was kind of interested in the aspect of having foods whose growth did not need much water. We have no problem now having diets for our health, and this introduces not a perturbation, but two things I can think of. Actually, the dietary laws of the both the Jews and the Arabs, Muslims that is, I heard came about because, not because of trichinosis, because pigs use a lot of water, and the use of water restricted the use of pork, pigs. And also there seems to be a trend now to use camel's milk. I heard camel's milk is getting very popular. So I was wondering if that is part of this trend of maybe camel's meat would be good also, maybe just propagating more camels would be better. I'm just wondering if that's part of this drive to use foods that need less water.
I would just make one quick comment about pigs. In the context of virtual water, in the United States, we're now exporting a good chunk of our swine industry in terms of food to China. And so the issue of water in a number of countries, in a virtual sense, is about how do we feed those burgeoning populations with essentially the meat and other agricultural products that are coming from our region. And now the United States is one of those cash crop places in the case of pork going to East Asia.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on that. I'm Elizabeth Bryan from the International Food Policy Research Institute. Yeah, definitely agricultural intensification is an important solution, I think. There are lots of technologies available, and in particular with the threat of climate change and a lot of uncertainty around that, we need to really look at some of these solutions. Switching livestock is actually a very important adaptation strategy for climate change. Some species require less water. Again, camels are popular in some parts of the world and maybe increasingly more so. Some of the smaller animals like sheep and goats are being used instead of livestock in areas where drought is increasing. And then you have other structures that are good for cropland as well to get more crops per drop of water. But I think we need to be careful that, again, these kinds of solutions need to be locally specific. It's a little bit harder to scale up some of the technologies that might work in some area versus another. And I mean, we've seen in Ethiopia, for example, they take water harvesting structures that they got in China and thought they could put them throughout the entire country, and half of them failed and just stopped being used. So we need to look at these solutions, but we need to be very careful in how they're developed in each area, and we need local extension agents that really work with farmers to develop locally appropriate solutions.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Krause. I'm from the National Environmental Education Foundation. And I just wanted to kind of to follow up on some comments that Dr. Lovejoy made about public understanding of water issues. It turns out that the vast majority of Americans cannot define watershed in a multiple choice format. The vast majority of Americans have no idea what a watershed is, that they are on a watershed. And yes, they do think that, well, where does water come from? It comes from the tap. A little over 100 years ago, John Wesley Powell proposed dividing state boundaries along watershed lines. And I wonder how much better Americans' understanding of water issues would be if that had come to fruition instead of just having the sort of ridiculously contrived systems of lines that we have for our current state and county boundaries. I was encouraged by Paulo's comments, or his joke, the joke that they have in Brazil about Brazil produces its own rainfall. And I'm just wondering if maybe those of you who have traveled more and talked to local populations, how do others' understandings of these water issues and watersheds and water limitations compare to those in the United States? And are there models for education in the developing world that we can possibly use to better educate Americans and get us to make better choices about our infrastructure?
Just make an observation. I don't want to be misunderstood. In Brazil, there is, I think, one of the challenges, an overabundance of water now. But and this historically has led people to not be careful about water in Brazil because we have water all over the place. But the pressures, political pressures, and more knowledge, scientific knowledge, has led to a sort of a new attitude towards that. That is, that's about preserving the Amazon because it is the rainmaker, and we need that. It's not because we like to hug trees, although we do. It's because we need it. It's an economic necessity. Preserving the Amazon is an economic decision in Brazil. It is becoming that. That is what makes the idea viable. And that is the good news. But I don't want to give you a notion that in Brazil we are really, we figured this one out and we are doing everything right, because we are not.
Well, I mean, I would just say that still, the fact that that kind of understanding of hydrology has at least gone to the higher levels of decision-making is, I find, almost remarkable compared to some of the things that are talked about in the United States in our hallowed halls of Congress.
And we owe a lot of that in Brazil to one person, right here.
Well, the science was Brazilian.
Yes.
Two related comments. One, on the watershed-based jurisdictions. It sounds really good in principle if you are able to support yourselves within watershed areas, but there are issues that pop up. For example, in the when I was working in the United Nations, the Dnieper River Basin, Ukraine is downstream from Belarus and Russia, and the Ukrainians just wanted the toxic data that they were collecting from the upstream riparians, and they said no. They were all cooperating and getting money from the United Nations, everything, but it's like, no, we don't want you to know what we're dumping into your river. And where you have a basin set up like that, whether it's there or in Turkey or in in some places, wherever you have an upstream riparian and a downstream riparian, and particularly where the upstream riparian's very relatively politically strong, someone gets disadvantaged by what's going on. Often, you can play hydropolitics, is sometimes referred. And by contrast, if you looked at the example of if they were able to look across watershed boundaries and say, hey, you know what? Ukraine's downstream from Belarus in terms of the Dnieper, but we're upstream with respect to the bug. So, if you pollute us and don't share data, we're not going to do it the other way around. So this opportunity of doing a quid pro quo in some ways, I think, is very powerful. The United States and Canada's in the International Joint Commission, which supervises and oversees the water boundaries. The water crosses the international boundary between Canada and the United States, is a model for over a century of how do we share water given that we're both downstream from each other. So I think there's a lot of political advantages from working across watershed scales as well. On the issue of environmental implication in the United States, I lead 2 projects that collectively aim to bring about 10,000 middle school students per year from Northern Virginia out to learn about their local watershed. And there is a very low understanding of those things at the middle school age. They can probably do a basic water cycle, but they've never actually gone out and, in a lot of cases, touched a stream, or, I'm allowed to do that, pulled a crayfish out of the water, and developing that kind of value and stewardship value and understanding of how it connects. I connect to my watershed, what goes in me, what goes out of me, what's near me, what's downstream, where my food comes from, and is something I think we're losing in the urbanization of our population, the United States and globally. Because if you ask someone who's a subsistence level farmer or even a cash farmer, they know what water's about. That's my livelihood. It's we who view water as something that comes out of a tap as opposed to something that comes to the environment that I think are much more challenged in developing that intuition. And your role and those of our other colleagues around the world that are focusing on environmental education, it's basically reacquainting us with something that all our ancestors and our rural contemporaries already know, as far as I can tell.
Yes. Here. Okay.
I think on that note, and just curious to see what you think about privatization of water and the municipal level. And I think as far as educating folks is concerned, apologies for taking the cynical approach, but one way they'll figure it out is if a company like Veolia Water comes in, buys out their water resources, then all of a sudden their price goes up 30-40%. All of a sudden they're going to realize that, water was never priced efficiently, and now that a company is running like a business, they're presented with a whole kind of host of new challenges. So I was just kind of curious to see what you thought about that kind of part of the whole industry as far as privatization is concerned, or how that becomes, affects the idea of water as a human right and the cost that comes into it.
It belongs to the union.
Well, I can't help but comment that when that happened in Bolivia, the government fell.
I don't think it's a viable idea in Brazil because I think water is treated like a mineral good. It belongs to the union. It belongs to all of us. It doesn't belong to, I think this idea of you could maybe privatize some of the management in distribution, but that would be a challenging one. And many other important things have to happen before I think we try even think about that. I have just in the middle there, please, and then I'm coming here.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone, for a wonderful panel. And just a quick note, the word for Botswana's currency is actually water. So that's just a little anecdote. But as far as what Tetra Tech has been doing to support U.S. EPA's Global Change and Research Program, we've been looking at the impact of climate change on 20 different watersheds in the U.S. And what we found, and it's basically all based off of the A2 IPCC storyline data, and we've used 3 different ways to downscale the regional data. And in the 5 pilot areas that the study's not finished, there's been really different results dependent on which method to downscale you actually use. And so when you think of climate change and basically how to look at it from a global perspective, and then say, okay, where do we focus our resources and our energy from both the water scarcity as well as a potential flooding and just changes in monsoonal activities and things like that. It's I think there's still some real questions there. So Just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, let me go here and then the gentleman. Yeah, why don't, Mike, first here and then, and then, yes, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'm Tim Resch. I work for the U.S. Agency for International Development. I just two things quick. One, there was an answer on a multiple use test that I took in forestry school that noted that a watershed was one of those small buildings along rivers and streams that measure water flow. But not necessarily my solution, but a solution that I see that wasn't kind of in the inventory. Let's call it guarded optimism. Is the local and international recognition of water as instability or conflict, and the efforts that we're doing in conflict mitigation, and perhaps some of the efforts on river basin commissions and lake basin commissions to where stakeholders may subjugate their own institutional interests for the kind of the greater good, or looking for not lose too bad kinds of situations. So I see some solution in a growing international understanding of water wars and water, as we noted, a source of instability in countries, and some attention to trying to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
Randy.
Yeah, Randy Curtis with Nature Conservancy. John Wesley Powell's spirit still survives. I just came back from a week in Colombia where they have suffered tremendous floods on the Magdalena River, some estimates as high as 6% of GDP. This was sort of lost in the news because of all the flooding in Australia, but they went through an emergency policy period where in several weeks they pushed through 36 new decrees, with the Environment Ministry working till 4 a.m. in the morning with the President's office. And one of the decrees was to reorganize the regional environmental authorities along watershed lines. It had been along political jurisdictions. So remains to be seen how much enforcement authority and regulatory authority they'll be given, because they didn't have a lot to begin with. So just because they've organized the boundaries along watershed lines is not in and of itself sufficient. But that's a pretty good news story. I thought it was worth sharing.
I'd like to ask a question. You talked about watersheds. I happen to have a son that works for a company called Watershed Management in Montana. And one of the things that they do is removing river dams and doing that. What is the preliminary? Is there a preliminary evaluation of all that effort that started years ago of removing river dams, mostly in the West, right?
Well, some of it's in the East.
In the East. What is there an evaluation of that? Is that something that is showing the results that were expected?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, we've been involved in the Penobscot in Maine, actually, for removal of dams, and they are building in terms of the monitoring of the impacts and the results. I mean, they had already projections in terms of the returns it'll have while not losing also the energy production, because that's part of this whole discussion is if you move toward one solution, make sure the losses don't occur, whether it's to the companies or municipalities. And so at least, I don't know about the cases out west, but certainly out of the ones we've been involved in out here on the East Coast, that has been, at least that was built in the studies, and then there's being in terms of monitoring that will go on after the dams are removed.
I do know that sort of in the eastern half of the country, there are tens of thousands of dams that were built at the beginning of the industrial era, most of which no longer have any entity responsible for their security or functioning. More than 3,000 in Pennsylvania alone. So it's a big ongoing issue.
Sorry, just to go back to the questions to the points about downscaling. The United States Geological Survey is now working on its own models for downscaling to local metropolitan scales that may be very useful as that's developing. They're putting a lot of federal government money into that. Afterwards, I could try to look up that contact for you. In addition, I think when we talk about local scale, in some ways, the climate changing that's happening is embodied in the institutions that are monitoring that basin. So, for example, in this region, the USGS is monitoring flows on the Potomac River, which is a slow integrator of what's happening across the year. And we know that the snowmelt is happening at a different size and a different volume now than it was a generation or two ago. So sometimes I think models can bring us in a direction of missing the fact that we have some of that knowledge embedded in the actual local infrastructure knowledge and et cetera, and actually connecting back with the issue of watershed-based jurisdiction. I'm an alternate commissioner to the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin, which over the last 60 years or so has actually been 7 years, maybe 60 years, has been working very hard on trying to get the jurisdiction of Maryland, Virginia, the District of Columbia, and upstream Pennsylvania and West Virginia to basically cooperate to make sure there's enough water for everyone. And it's there have been some issues that have gone all the way to the Supreme Court with respect to that water sharing between Maryland and Virginia. But by and large, they've bought into the idea that, hey, we've got to work together. And I think having those sorts of, in this case, a non-regulatory commission, in other places like the Delaware River, there's actually a regulatory commission, but essentially having those cooperative bodies in place intranationally as well as internationally, like the Danube River Commission, the Internet, and its counterparts in Europe, are ways to basically work through cooperatively some of those challenges and are very, very important. But I wouldn't replace the nation state or the county or the state with the watershed boundary, because there are so many other issues we're trying to deal with that aren't necessarily water related.
I think we do a wrap.
Would you like to wrap this up? And
you want to make any final comments?
That was probably a pretty good summary on my part, so I'll pass.
But the only thing that I just wanted to add, and it was on the climate issue too, is there's a lot of the climate analysis being done by agencies, but also keep in mind, I think the role of the private sector is increasing in this as well. I mean, the example I used in terms of water funds, one of the water funds in Colombia, which is with the Sugarcane Growers Association, they've actually been investing in climate vulnerability analysis because it actually is going to impact their business in the long term. So I think with all of this, we're seeing much more in terms of roles evolving that maybe in the past have not been traditionally how we've thought about some of these areas, but the private sector, the non-governmental community working together with government agencies, I'm seeing much more and more of that in the last few years, so that things like integrated river basin management, I think there's much more potential than there was maybe 10, 20 years ago. And I think that's when we can get at these different solutions at different scales if partners are kind of willing to put aside their own vested interests and say, okay, we'll put a bit of that aside so we can come together in the long term on improving water resource management.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank Dan and Karin for contributing to a really rich afternoon of discussion. And lurking here, of course, is this ongoing issue of scale. And I think much like biodiversity conservation, this is one of those issues which has to work both at the local level and yet also work at the global scale. So much of, I think, moving it to the global scale is taking the things that work, doing experiments, figuring out what seems to work better in particular situations, and then actually trying to bring it to scale.
Well, thank you, Dan, Karin, and Tom, for your contributions this wonderful afternoon. I believe the next session of this series will happen exactly a month from March 23. So please keep checking on George Mason's website, or our website, and we'll obviously welcome you back here. And on behalf of the Jeff Tabelco, the Environmental Change and Security Program, the Brazil Institute, I wanted to thank you very much. A round of applause to the presenters.